Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar today, Closing the Gender Gap for a More Resilient World. My name is Megan Rowling. I'm the editor of Zilient.org, which is a news website and network for global practitioners of resilience around the world. I'm also a journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is the charitable arm of Reuters News. So today we have two very good reasons to be talking about our subject. First of all, ahead of the World Economic Forum, the WEF in Davos next week, we think it's super important to highlight how achieving parity between women and men can put our societies and our economies in a better position to develop sustainably and tackle modern day challenges, whether those are climate change, migration, or financial shocks. And it's worth noting that all the co-chairs at Davos this year are going to be women, which suggests there is at least growing will to shift the balance in the corridors of power. Our second good reason is that we're holding this event the day before women around the world return to the streets 1 year after millions marched to protest the election of US President Donald Trump. And this time around, organisers in the US have a new goal, which is to elect more advocates of women's rights, which would be a great thing. So today, we're going to start with the state of play on the gender gap worldwide, and then we'll move on to what's being done about it and look at some promising initiatives that can help us all move forwards instead of backwards, because despite progress on women's rights in a growing number of countries, the WEF's annual report in 2017 found that the global gender gap had widened for the first time since 2006, and it remains especially large on economic participation and political empowerment. So to find out more about this, we're going to hear from Dr. Vesselina Ratcheva, who is data lead for the World Economic Forum System Initiative on Education, Gender and Work. She is a co-author of the Forum's Global Gender Gap Report, as well as other important reports, and she uses research to find the best ways to ensure more just social and political systems. After Vesselina's presentation on the Gender Gap Report, we'll be talking to Natasa Nikolic, who is the lead for the EY Entrepreneurial Winning Women programs in Europe, the Middle East, India and Africa. These identify high potential women entrepreneurs and provide them with support to speed up the growth of their businesses. Natasha is also part of EY's Women Fast Forward team, which was set up in 2015 and aims to accelerate gender parity in the workplace. And our third guest today is Gail Klintworth, who is Director of Business Transformation with the Business and Sustainable Development Commission. She's also a partner at Systemic, an advisor in investment business that works with various industries to facilitate the shift to a more sustainable economy. Before that, Gail was Executive Director of investment management firm Old Mutual PLC and also Chief Sustainability Officer at Unilever, which has been a leader on corporate, social and environmental stewardship. So before we get started, I just want to let everybody know that we're also broadcasting this event live on Facebook. And if you would like to follow tweets or indeed put out tweets of your own, we're going to be using the hashtags hashtag WEF18, which is the hashtag for the World Economic Forum, which starts next week, and also hashtag gender gap. We're going to be trying to leave a bit of time for question and answer with our guests as well. So if you would like to answer a question, ask a question at any time during the event, please put that into the chat inside. If you're in the webinar or if you're watching on Facebook, you can post questions and comments underneath the video. Okay, so we shall start with Vesselina, who is going to present some of the main findings and recommendations from the WEF's Global Gender Gap Report. Thanks, Vesselina.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm coming here from Geneva, and we at the World Economic Forum have incubated an initiative on education, gender and work. So some of the key themes around inclusion and around maintaining a fair world through good wages and good skills. And here, for the past 10 years, we have actually, been looking at a progressing gender gap. The Gender Gap Index was conceived in 2006 and has been tracking progress. And this year, we found something concerning, which is that the gender gap is not only not progressing very fast, it's actually going backwards across all pillars. And we have been seeing it wobble for a few years. We have seen that economic progress for women has not moved on as strongly as we think it should. And this year, we think this is cause for alarm and for renewing efforts towards creating a shared vision in a fractured world around gender. And this is, in fact, this idea of creating a shared vision in a fractured world is the theme of our annual meeting starting on Monday. So let me tell you a little bit about why you should believe that actually gender is going backwards. Because of course we've seen much progress in this area, and we see that the voice of women is getting larger and larger. So if we move on to our kind of overview slide of the data we use to tell the story, we actually use some of the best internationally available data, standardized by the UN and by the World Bank, to show that, in fact, this is reflected in the figures we see day to day. And we also use real casting data from platforms such as LinkedIn, which reveal what is going on live in industries. We cover the whole world. And in the global view of our index, we see that there are definite patterns by region, but overall, there are also patterns by theme. Our index looks at gender parity in 4 dimensions. One is economic gender parity, one is educational gender parity, one is health and survival, and one is political empowerment. So for education, we actually see that women have made large progress. The educational gender gap for women is very small, which means that there is no issue with there not being enough talented women. In fact, the main issue we see is that there isn't enough inclusion of women in the workplace, and there isn't enough political representation of women. So why this gender gap remains in politics. A very critical gender gap is the economic one, because we feel that as long as women are included in the workplace, they have access to very resilient elements of power, financial power and empowerment, representation in shaping the growth of today's businesses and the growth of economies. So have we seen this pattern change over the past few years? Yes, we have, but primarily this change has come from the political empowerment pillar. There, where the score has been pretty bad, historically, it has improved dramatically, about 8% gap change. Whereas things like pillars such as the economic pillar, we've seen a stagnation that is deeply concerning. Geographically, the parity is also somewhat contested. We see that some regions do better and others worse. So in fact, Iceland and Norway, Finland, the Nordics do particularly well, whereas countries in the Middle East do a little bit less well. However, we've also seen strong progress from economies that didn't do particularly well in the past, such as economies in Latin America. And in fact, some of our practice work is focusing on fast forwarding that change through task forces in Chile and in Panama. So what is behind this dramatic change in in the gap. It has been closing in the past, now it started reversing. Right now, we're projecting to close the gender gap in about 217 years. That is simply too slow. One aspect of what's going wrong really is that overall the world is getting wealthier, but wages are being generated at different rates for men and women. The average wage for men has risen much more steeply for men than for women. So there's a definite component there where women are not being remunerated for the work they do at an equal rate. We also see that women occupy much less roles in senior management, and that is a gap that was closing at a higher rate up to 2011 and has started quickly going back to a lower position in the past few years. And finally, what we are also seeing is that economic activity for women is falling. So one of the dimensions that we know this is related to is the fact that women take on a larger burden of unpaid work in the home, and that affects their capacity to participate in the labor market. And there are issues there around mindset and motivation and societal messaging overall. So it would be great to actually dig in a little bit more into particularly the gender wage gap. We see a fascinating curve there where a lot of economies that actually don't have such high wages actually manage to distribute them quite equitably between men and women. And if we zoom in to economies where wages are on average very high, there's a wide disparity in gender parity. So in economies such as Singapore, in the United Kingdom, the United States, the Netherlands, we see that the wage gap between men and women is a lot larger than economies such as Norway, where wages are really in the same dimension overall. So there's something to be done there around scaling appropriately effective approaches to reducing the wage gap. And a lot of countries are leading on this in the current year. We've seen Iceland make positive steps, and we've seen also the United Kingdom make positive steps to introduce new legislation. Finally, one other dimension that we need to consider is that actually within the economic sphere, industries are heavily out of balance. There are industries in which many women are well represented, and there are industries where they're not. In education and healthcare, we see a lot of women represented. And the main aspect to work on there is really to ensure that when they're represented in leadership roles. So whereas there's definitely a strong representation of women in leadership roles, in healthcare, it needs to be resolved. Similarly, you see that the trend for the representation of women in the industry context more widely is not always reflected in the degree to which they are in charge of decision making in the companies in which they're part. So that is one strong theme to take in when thinking about resolving this very hard to push economic gap. And so overall, as we look towards creating a wide platform for business leaders and policymakers to discuss the gender gaps, our insights work, and in particular a global gender gap report, aims to push out a strong message on where the issue lies. And we hope that as people reflect on the data available through this report and through the online data platform, where we have featured a lot of the in-depth deep dives on where the gaps are, then positive policy interventions can meet those gaps and narrow them and accelerate progress, so that we're not looking to gender gaps closing in 217 years, so that we are looking to gender gaps closing much faster.
Absolutely, Vesselina. I think you've really laid out the problem very well there. And as you say, it's particularly concerning when you think, over the past decades, how much we think we might have made progress, and we certainly have made progress, but it really isn't going fast enough. And we still have these situations where, within 2 to 3 years, we can take steps backwards on economic progress, for example. And I think we're going to spend quite a lot of the rest of the webinar talking about what we can do to close this gap, particularly on the sort of business and economic front. And so I'm just wondering if there's anything that the World Economic Forum is doing specifically in order to drive action on this. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what's happening there.
Well, we have two approaches. One is that we, of course, convene practitioners from business and from policy in discussions around producing these key issue papers that look at the ways in which you can shift different gaps through in-depth analysis of existing practices and the principles that can derive from these. So we create gender toolkits that speak to different elements of the gap. And of course, we also have country level work, because we believe that through our role as a platform for public-private partnership, we have the ability to bring together different stakeholders in a very distinctive role, really, on the international domain. So with our task force in Chile, for example, we have brought around more than 100 businesses together with policymakers, try and really shape a productive policy and business-oriented plan closing gender gaps. And I believe we're going to start seeing a lot of progress as a result of that.
That sounds like a promising initiative. I just wanted to let people know that if they have any specific questions for Vesselina about this report or the work of the World Economic Forum, you can pop those into the chat now, or we can circle back to those later on in the webinar. We also ask people sometimes to send in questions beforehand when they register, and one of the questions that cropped up, which I think is perhaps good for you to answer, is there a difference in the gender gap that we can identify between developed countries and developing countries? You mentioned some specific countries that are doing better, but is it fair to say that there's a distinction, or does it really just depend on individual countries' policies rather than a level of national income?
So both within the cohort of developed countries and developing countries, we see strong and not so strong performers. So we see a host of developed economies on the top 10 of the Global Gender Gap Index, but Rwanda is always also there. And that reflects a set of policies that have created a different level of gender parity there. Countries like Nicaragua, which also very definite developmental issues, is also making very strong progress in this area, and they've had a national plan on creating gender parity for a number of years now, and we can see those effects in their narrowing of the global gender gap. One dimension in which we do see a difference is in education. So where resources for scaling education are scarce, gender norms do play a larger part in inhibiting parents' choices sometimes to encourage girls to stay in education to the same rate as boys. And a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa continue to have very large education gender gaps. But really in the economic domain, we see that it's a lot more varied. There are many developed economies that are really failing highly educated women who are ready for the labor market but are not included. And that's why in many ways, although their issues definitely do be solved, in terms of including women in education across many spheres and across different regions, we've often focused on the economic gender gap, because that is where we expect that everybody should be able to achieve some basic level of parity.
Pardon me, sorry, I just had to unmute myself. So it's very much about policies and setting the agenda rather than levels of income at the national level, which I think is important for people to hear, especially if they're tuning in from developing countries. I wanted to bring Natasa Nikolic in now from EY. Natasa, EY has been doing a lot of work on gender parity, and you, as well as the programs that I mentioned earlier, are also part of EY's team that supported the formation and efforts of Women 20, or W20, which is a new group under the G20 countries, which is focused on gender equality and economic inclusiveness. So, Natasa, I was wondering if you could explain to us, why is gender parity important for EY, and what has the company done since launching Women Fast Forward 2 years ago?
Thank you, Megan, and good afternoon, everyone. So yes, it's right. Gender parity is very fundamental for EY, and it's actually the core of our Building a Better Working World vision, which we demonstrated in 2015 when at the World Economic Forum in Davos, we launched the Women Fast Forward. At that time, we thought it would be 80 years before women could achieve a gender parity. And, you know, if you think about it, it was astonishing, really, that it would take 4 generations before we come to live in a world where men and women would be truly equal in education, health, politics, and economy. This is, at that point, we ask ourselves, you know, what more could we do? Because, you know, as Nicolina said, it's just really too long to wait. And we said, we can't wait. So we asked ourselves what it is that we can do, both internally within our own organization, but also externally in the market to advance women. And even before the launch of the Women Fast Forward, we had a lot of networks and a lot of activities within the organization, but also externally working with women. For example, we've worked with women entrepreneurs, with women in government and politics, even with female athletes who are transitioning their career from sports into business. But we felt that there could be something even more than that we could do. And this is how actually Women Fast Forward came to life, as a platform that unites all these efforts. Unfortunately, since that time, and as we have just heard Vesselina saying, the gender parity continued to move further away, and it's now you know, furthest than ever. It's 217 years, and you know, to think about it, it will take 2 centuries for women and men to have equal participation and opportunity in the workplace. It's just really, really depressing. So we believe that one of the ways, or the best approach to solving issues like this, is to bring the voice of the private and public sector in a dialogue together, and this is the best and most effective way to make the change happen in the society. We have done the same with this issue as well, with the issue of economic empowerment of women. So in 2015, we established Women 3, the Power of 3 Forum, which is a forum that convenes the senior level of women and men in business, entrepreneurship, and government. And with the aim to drive action that's focused on the most prestigious, the most pressing issues locally. And we thought that, activism on both individual and collective level is something that, is really needed, because, we all were aware of what is happening and the facts, but, what it is actually that we can do to make the change happen and to create the so-called ripple effect. So through this forum, which had a series of roundtable discussions across Europe, Middle East, India, and Africa, we engaged various stakeholders on various markets, and we managed to come to 5 recommended actions that we then brought back to the regions, and we actually acted on those. So we were implementing some of those recommended actions on the local ground with our clients, with our people within EY, with the forum participants, and together with the communities. So you mentioned the formation of W20. So the work that this forum has done was actually something that led to and it was very much aligned to the formation of W20. So we helped support the formation and efforts of this new G20 group that was, it was incepted in 2015 in Turkey, when Turkey had a G20 presidency, and EY was one of the founding sponsors of this group, and ever since we've continued to work with them. So following next year, we worked with the W20 in China. Last year, we've done a tremendous amount of work and effort with the W20 in Germany, and we are now really happy to continue working with the W20 in Argentina.
What does it do in practice, Natasha? Because it may not be clear to a lot of people watching what these groups with exciting sounding names actually achieve when it comes to their sort of personal lives. How can groups like this help all of us sitting in our respective offices, would you say?
Yes, so the main goal of the W20 group is to put gender equality and the women's economic empowerment at the core of the G20 agenda. So during the year where the presidency is, for example, last year in Germany, local organizations are working with all relevant stakeholders, and then they come with a set of recommended actions that are then presented through a communiqué to the G20 as, what we W20 group believe G20 should be doing in order to put the gender equity on the agenda and actually to support the women's economic empowerment. So if you remember last year, for example, that communiqué was, Chancellor Angela Merkel was the one who was presenting that communiqué in April in 2017. So this year it's Argentina has a presidency, so we are working with them also in the areas they have selected as a focus areas. So each year, each W20 group selects the areas of focus. For example, this year, Argentina, one of the areas that's within their focus that hasn't been before is the rural economy, for example. So they have a focus on labor inclusion, digital inclusion, financial inclusion, but also the rural economy, which is an important topic in Argentina or Latin America.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear. So the subject can vary according to what's a priority for that particular country. But I was also just interested to hear a little bit more about the work that you do with women entrepreneurs in terms of supporting their businesses. How do you go about selecting those women entrepreneurs that get support from EY?
So for us at EY, the areas that we are focused on within the Women Fast Forward platform is very much aligned with the W20, and entrepreneurship is, of course, one of the areas that's very high on the W20 agenda as well. So EY has a long-standing tradition of working with entrepreneurs, more than 30 years. And 10 years ago, we actually established or we started a program that's called the Entrepreneurial Winning Women, which is an executive, executive education program that identifies high potential women entrepreneurs and then helps them scale their businesses by connecting them with resources, networks, and expertise. So in its 10th year of existence, and we've just celebrated in November at a global gathering, we now have reached 50 countries and have a global community of more than 400 women entrepreneurs. So each year in those markets where we have the program, we select a group of women entrepreneurs that fit the criteria, and then we work with them. We call that a class, and then we work with that class for 1 year. It's an evergreen program, so even after that 1 year has passed, they are, of course, more than welcome to stay for as long as they feel they're benefiting from the program and from that a global community. And we've seen a great progress the businesses have made since joining the program. Because it's some of the things that the program offers is a peer learning, help with access to capital, networking, capacity building, but also helping them build their public profile, which is something that's usually not a very high on the agenda of women entrepreneurs. So yes, we have seen a great success of the program and a big interest because women entrepreneurs are a great economic power. They do start their businesses at a similar rate that men do, but unfortunately not nearly as many of them scale their businesses. So this is a program that's intended actually for established businesses who need help scaling up. This is where we come in. And one of the other ways that we have done, for example, last year to support women entrepreneurs, of course, we have a well-established diversity supplier processes within the company. So we try to source services and products from diverse suppliers, but we also engage with companies who also have supplier diversity within their DNA. Last year in September, EY announced a commitment to direct $100 million of global purchasing to women owned businesses over the next 3 years. And this was the commitment that was part of the Global Citizen Initiative.
That's really interesting, Natasha, because I think you've been talking about some really practical ways in which you can shift the dial and actually give women the opportunity to do things and expand their business and make a huge difference, which is, sometimes feels quite a contrast to the fine words that, say, can come out from a G20 communique. I'd like to bring in Gail Klintworth now from the Business and Sustainable Development Commission. Gail, you've got a lot of experience working, I would say, in big business, which has no doubt been incredibly valuable for your work with the Commission. And as far as I understand it, one of the aims of the Commission has been to change the conversation about women. So away from them being seen just as beneficiaries of the global goals to them being leaders who are absolutely critical to achieving those goals. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what the barriers are to women being leaders in these key areas, and how would you say things have changed since the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, were adopted in 2015?
My goodness, those are big questions, right? So how have things changed, and how can women lead more? I guess I want to kind of move the conversation, if I could, to what can we do together? So, you know, we can look at all sorts of interesting statistics about how women are participating or not, or what I would really love to do is to invite, I guess, women more broadly to lead for the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason I want to raise that, and I'm not answering your question, Megan, the reason I'm raising that is because everything that I've looked at and that the Business Commission has done is showing that if women leaders really adopt the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals as something that they care deeply about, in fact, they can lead for an amazing change in our world that we're all looking for. So, you know, if you're asking me to give you some statistics about what should change, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you that women leading for the Sustainable Development Goals, whether they are, you know, Dr. Vesselina or Natasha or whoever's listening to this, is going to make a huge difference to what we're trying to do in the world. And why do I say that? So I say that because you can go online and look at whatever needs to be said about the reason you get more women engaged in driving on the ground initiatives, because they will make sure that it actually delivers. Secondly, there's a lot of research, and I'll share an idea with you shortly, that women leaders care deeply about many of the things we're talking about. So whether it's health, climate change, food loss, etc., because they're living it. So sadly, still, we don't have a situation where as many, I guess, as many male business leaders are living the kind of environment that we're talking about. So, so women leaders are incredibly important to drive this forward. And then, I guess, finally, you know, rather than talking about what we need to do, around moving reports out, or I guess my only call for action is for women and men leaders out there to really understand the power you have, and particularly women, understand the power you have to begin to create the world that we want.
Absolutely, I think that's key, isn't it? That people need to feel empowered. Women need to feel that if they make the effort, the world is going to respond, and that things will start to change. But I think one of the problems is that people, women especially, perhaps feel that there are barriers, obstacles to them becoming leaders, and that can actually deter them from even trying. I mean, in your own experience, what have been the biggest barriers, and how did you overcome them in your own career? I think people are always quite keen to hear about personal experiences because it can inspire them.
There are barriers all the time, right? So, you know, people don't like what you're saying, people don't like what you're trying to do. I don't think I have ever really thought that there's a force out there trying to stop me from trying to do what I'm trying to do. So I think that is one message, which is, you know, it's all in your own head. The second is that if you have a really great idea, whether you're a man or a woman, that's going to drive change, is going to, I guess, create a shift in the economy, because that's important, then people like that. So push it forward. The third, I guess, and I guess this is talking to women out there, I know it can be hard because they're working in large organizations where potentially the power is looks to be more male. I'd say, first of all, get your idea and find lots of people that want to help you drive it forward. Secondly, I'd say find a good, decent person, and there are many of them, who is kind of more in charge of the power dynamics, and work with them to help you drive things forward. And drive things forward for me in this conversation is more around the impact you can create rather than, you know, necessarily your advancements.
Very good advice. Yeah, I think it's just really great to hear personal advice from people who have, you know, obviously had a lot of experience in the corporate world, and how you do that as a person rather than a number on a corporate sort of HR sheet, because at the end of the day we're all people, and if we have great ideas and get the right support behind us and allies and champions, then obviously that's going to make a big difference in terms of being able to put those into practice. So I just wanted to open up the conversation a little bit now, and just to say to everybody who's watching either on Facebook or on the webinar, if you do have specific questions or general questions for our experts today, please do pop them into the chat or under the video on Facebook, and we will try and put those to our panelists. So just while we're waiting for you to do that, we had some questions that came in before, so I think I want to touch on something that's been in the news in the last week or two, which is about the pay gap. We had Carrie Gracie at the BBC resigning from her China editorship due to the fact that she saw there was a major pay gap between herself and the other international editors who were men, and that sort of very firmly put this onto the agenda. And actually, within the questions that came in before this event, one of them was, how do you identify disparity in pay when, you know, pay levels are supposed to be confidential? And then what do you actually do about it in practical terms? I mean, that is quite specific, but I think it's something that is actually quite often on all of our minds in the economic and business world. I'm just wondering if anyone would like to come in on that specifically. If anyone has experience of that or ideas about how women can act on the pay gap, which we know very much exists. Natasha, is that, oh, Vesselina, okay, please go ahead.
I'll let the other panelists maybe speak to the exact application, but overall, where we've seen the big areas lie and where you need to look out for in implementation is basically comparing like-for-like jobs and being able to map the jobs in existence in your organization. And that is one dimension in which we see this becomes quite a large process for some companies, in the degree to which they actually have this data available right now. So in our work on suggesting some principles for moving forward on action, we've recommended that companies start by doing a kind of mapping exercise of their organization right now and understanding gender gaps within the organization itself. And that is one critical step in being able to move forward in actually resolving this in practice, because in practice then you have to move on to other things like understanding how the performance review process is run, how promotions processes move forward, how people get raises. But to begin with, you need to be able to map pay within your organization and the structure of your organization, and not everybody has that data. But it's interesting that some tools are being made by individuals who are looking to scale that process for companies. So one company in the UK, for example, is using a kind of an automated algorithm to pull through payroll data and allow companies to get a much quicker, easier way of understanding their initial stats.
Well, that's super interesting that these kind of tools are being developed and are out there and can help people. Natasha, I'm wondering at EY, is there any discussion around that? And if so, what kind of initiatives are perhaps being taken at your end?
Well, clearly we had to first, look into our own yard before we actually went to the market to talk about it. There are, of course, some of the lessons we've learned in our own gender gap journey. And one of the lessons I would say is, measure the gaps. You need to have, you need to be able to measure it to be able to act upon it. Clearly, this is not a topic that's, it's not an easy topic, and I think financial services firms they haven't been known in the past as to be the best in this area. But I think things are changing, and if you look at it, EY, and I think we are addressing the matter properly. It's about transparency. It's about having, as Vesselina mentioned, the assessment being gender blind, and also the pays. Of course, in some organizations, this will create a lot of discomfort, but it's important to use the analytics, to depersonalize the matter. There is a lot to be done. We are, taking it seriously, and we are working on it. And, I think in some parts of the world, EY is, has already reached the level of having the equal pay, but we are hoping to get there worldwide soon.
Indeed, I think that would set a fantastic example to other companies. Definitely. And one other issue that's cropped up within the questions that we've had is about care and the burden of care, and how that often falls on women and is something that doesn't have an economic value put upon it, and it's one of those kind of elephants in the room, an unspoken thing. And I'm just wondering if any of your organizations have done work on that in order to flag that up and show that it is something that can hold women back. I think, Gail, maybe you have a comment on that?
Yeah, Megan, so I want to, first of all, I guess, talk to the people out there that are listening to us that are less concerned about corporate issues, right? And more concerned, particularly women, about what on earth they can do to change the world. So I think it's fabulous that we're doing all of these measurements, but I think one of the most important messages we need to get out is that it is your life as a woman. You need to choose what it is you want to focus on, and you can shape how you impact, including how you care, and then of course all of these wonderful things that corporate companies are trying to do to encourage it. That's fabulous. But you're in charge. And I think that is the message that I'm trying to send out through the Business Commission. So you are in charge of the impact you're making. So stop asking for people to help you do things. Can you even begin to think as a woman, or whoever, right, what do I really want, and how am I going to make a shift in this?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that's obviously super important, but I think maybe not everybody feels that they might be in a position to say,
right,
what do I want? And some women might also feel in a position more, what do they need in order to be able for them to get to the stage where they can then say, what do I want? And just to bring it back to that issue that I was talking about just now about care and the burden of care, I think that it feels to me as if there's much that has to be done in order to be able to free women up to ask those absolutely crucial questions that you're encouraging people to ask, Gail. And I think maybe Vesselina has a point to make with regards to that, the things that are basically holding women back from doing what they can do and fulfilling their potential.
So perhaps just to tie over to what Gail was saying, I mean, one critical request that women can make is for their partners and people around them to do an equal amount of the care work. Because when we did analysis in the 2016 report, so the gender gap report that looked at the unpaid work done by men and women in the household, out of the household, then we found out that is highly correlated with gender gaps. And that is not unexpected. So not the amount of unpaid work that men or women do, because what we must be aware is, of course, all of us have a lot of unpaid care responsibilities. And those are responsibilities that go to what we give back to society and to our families. So that is not something that is to be scorned, but what is concerning is the degree to which that is not equally distributed. So one large aspect that will help shift the burden that women sometimes have today is to redistribute that burden, and to make sure that women feel empowered to say, actually, I'm going to do this much, and then my partner is also going to do a fair amount, or the wider community of which I'm a part, I'm going to take a lot of responsibility for it, and so are men in the community. So it's that shared sense of ownership of the family arena, of the community arena, that will be very productive in ensuring that also we can move forward to economic gender parity, to an equal role in the private and the public domain. And there's some really interesting data for those that really want to follow up on this topic, created by the OECD, where the OECD has created this through actually a very extensive survey of day-to-day practices. People go and actually record their day-to-day activities, and those are associated with unpaid work of different dimensions, and then you can compare across geographies, and it's really striking. Japan has one of the largest inequalities in the amount of unpaid work done by men and women, and they also have a very big economic gender gap. And it sort of speaks to that issue that we see, that women carry a lot of weight, And that feeling of being overwhelmed means that you don't have the space to expand.
And I think one of the problems there is that if we don't know how much time is being spent on this kind of unpaid work and actually what the economic value of that is, then it's very hard to actually take action on it and change that situation. And as we don't have a great deal more time, I think we're going to have to start wrapping up here. But one of the comments that has come in on the chat from Hyunju Yoon is he's worked with communities in Laos. I think that's correct, and is saying that basically access to information is a problem, and it's very challenging. And when we're talking about things like the World Economic Forum and mainstream dialogues, it seems very different, very distant. And so we need to be more inclusive and more specific and give people as much information as possible. And I think that's how we would like to wrap up the conversation today, which is to give our speakers an opportunity to tell our listeners about some of the things that they're looking forward to and some of the practical tips that they can give, a call to action, if you like, from our experts here today, what people should be looking out for. And also we have International Women's Day coming up on March the 8th. So I'd just like to invite you to flag a couple of things that are coming up, some of the things that you're watching and how people can act on those. So as we have Davos next week, perhaps Vesselina, you'd like to point to a couple of things there that people can use to inform themselves and find out more about how to close this gap that we've been talking about today.
Next week we have an exciting program, and as usual Davos is going to bring leading voices from civil society, from business, from governments, and really also a generation of young people that we have made sure to include, because often the leaders of today's world aren't those that are going to be reaping the benefits of the changes that will come in 10, 20 years. They're people who have the maturity to guide it. And so really in our program, we have a set of sessions that can speak to some of the issues we've discussed already on behaviors and how we change behaviors in the workplace and in society to make sure that equality is a principle shared by everybody when it comes to gender. And on women in entrepreneurship, there is a great session that will be coming up on Friday. And these are a number of sessions that are also streamed live on the site. So no matter where you are, you can tune in and listen to some of our fascinating speakers from a number of different sectors.
Vesselina, is that wef.org people should be going to?
weforum.org.
Oh yeah, okay, thank you. weforum.org. We have that now. And Natasha, EY is also going to be present at Davos with a team there. And so I'm just wondering if you'd like to spell out what's happening and also your plans for International Women's Day.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Megan. So yes, we'll have a team, EY team at Davos next week, and everybody's really excited about it. So I think there is one thing that could be interesting for this group. Our session on Thursday, the 25th of January, called Women for Economic Growth, All Eyes on W20 and W7. There will be a panel discussion with prior and current W20 and W7 teams. It will be live on Facebook, so it will be easy to follow it. For more details, you can find on EY's Women Fast Forward Twitter channel and LinkedIn showcase page. As for the International Women's Day, EY is a proud campaign partner of the International Women's Day organization, and this is the third year that we are doing something really great with the organization. And we are now calling all of you who are participating here today to press for progress, which is this year's campaign theme. share with us, take part, let us know, show the world how are you pressing forward and progressing the gender parity.
Excellent. And I think, Gail, the Business and Sustainable Development Commission also has a plan for International Women's Day and a report coming out fairly soon, if that's right. Maybe you could fill us in on that, please.
I want to say to Natasa, you know, is there any way that you can make sure that your conversation is not only about women women equity, but more importantly, around how women can drive a change in the world? So, what are we trying to do? On International Women's Day, we want to ask everyone that cares about how we are trying to reshape the world to link into a very simple mechanism, which is, can you have a conversation with a few people, wherever you are, around what the Sustainable Development Goals mean for you? So, particularly women, we know, are incredible leaders to change the way the world works. So just imagine if, in all of our funny gender blah, blah, blah things we do, we have a little conversation about you as a woman, what on earth are you trying to leave as a legacy? And could you somehow, through the SDGs or through, understand your power? And that's, I guess, in a bizarre way, that I'm trying to somehow reach out. Not corporate, not anything, is ladies out there, you know what we need to do. So please, can we, in some way, get together and find out how we can lead the change we want and need in the future.
That's a fantastic call to action to end on, Gail. Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm really hoping that when the Global Gender Gap Report comes out for 2018, that it's going to show that this gap is being closed instead of widening as it did last year. And I think that if we all put in as much effort as you've encouraged us to do today, that hopefully that is going to be the kind of thing that makes a difference. And as you said, it doesn't have to be at a huge corporate high level. It can be in our daily lives, within our own spheres, and just reaching out to each other, listening to each other's needs and providing help among women where it's needed. So with that, I'd like to close the event today and say thank you so much to our three panelists, Gail, Natasha and Vesselina, who had to dive off slightly before the end because she has a lot to do for the World Economic Forum, and I think someone was after the room that she was in. So thank you so much. We will be writing up a piece about this event, and it will be posted on www.zilient.org at the beginning of next week. And so we hope to get the conversation going ahead of the Davos meeting, where we expect to see women out in full force and doing their thing and showing the men how it's done. So thank you very much indeed for watching and listening today, everybody. We really appreciate your participation, and we'll be back again next month with another live discussion for you. Thanks very much indeed. Goodbye, everybody.